The sun beat down hard on the dusty road leading to the old trailer park. It was the kind of summer heat that made the air shimmer above the pavement. Ray wiped the sweat from his brow as he walked home from the bus stop, his work boots kicking up little clouds of dust with each step. 3 miles each way, every day. Just another reality of life since his truck had broken down 2 months ago. At 45, Ray's hands told the story of his life. Calloused and strong, with oil permanently etched into the creases of his skin. Those hands could bring almost any engine back to life. For 20 years, he'd been the go-to mechanic at Wilson's Auto Shop until it closed down last spring. "Economy's changing," Mr. Wilson had said, his own eyes downcast as he handed out the final paychecks. "Big chains are taking over everything." Ray's trailer sat at the far end of Pinewood Community, a small plot of land his grandpa had bought back in the 70s. It wasn't much, faded blue paint peeling at the corners, a small porch he'd built himself, and a patch of garden where his mama's rosebush still bloomed against all odds. But it was his, free and clear, no landlord to answer to. These days, that counted for something. Inside, Ray set down his lunchbox and checked his phone. No calls. He'd put out word that he was doing repair jobs from home. Anything to keep the lights on while he looked for steady work. The fridge hummed loudly, another thing that needed fixing when he could spare the parts. "One day at a time," he mumbled to himself, a phrase his grandpa had repeated like gospel. Ray believed it, had to. After changing into a cleaner pair of jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days, Ray stepped back outside to water his mama's roses. That's when he heard it, the distinctive sound of a car engine struggling, followed by a hiss that any mechanic would recognize instantly. Radiator trouble. Ray looked up to see a shiny black car, some foreign luxury model worth more than he made in a year, pulled over about 100 yards down the road. Even from a distance he could see the steam billowing from under the hood. For a moment he considered going inside. Not his problem. People with cars like that had roadside assistance, special numbers to call for help. But then he remembered his grandpa's other saying, "Help comes round full circle." With a sigh, Ray grabbed his old red toolbox, the one that had been his companion since trade school, and headed toward the car. A woman stood beside it, phone in hand, looking frustrated. She wore the kind of clothes Ray only ever saw in department store windows. A crisp white blouse tucked into dark dress pants, shoes with red bottoms that seemed ridiculous for these dusty roads. Her hair was pulled back tight, sunglasses perched on top of her head. "No signal out here," Ray called as he approached. "Dead zone starts about a mile back." The woman turned, startled. For a second, wariness flashed across her face, the kind Ray had grown used to seeing when strangers first laid eyes on him. A big black man approaching on a lonely road made some folks nervous. Ray had learned long ago to move slow, keep his voice gentle. "Car trouble?" he asked, staying a respectful distance away. "Yes," she said, relief cautiously replacing her concern. "It just started steaming, and then, well, it died." Ray nodded. "Mind if I take a look? I'm a mechanic, was for 20 years before my shop closed down." The woman hesitated just long enough for Ray to notice, then nodded. "Please, I'd appreciate that. I'm supposed to be at a conference in the city by evening." Ray set down his toolbox and moved toward the car. "Pop the hood for me." Once the hood was up, it didn't take Ray long to spot the problem. A split radiator hose right where they always seemed to go. The hot rubber had finally given way after who knew how many miles. "Your radiator hose is shot," he explained, pointing to the crack without touching anything yet. "All your coolant leaked out and the engine overheated. Not good to drive it like this, you'll damage the engine." The woman sighed. "How long will it take to fix? Should I call a tow truck? If I can ever get service." Ray looked at the car, then back down the road toward his trailer. "I might have. Something that'll work as a temporary fix. Won't be pretty, but it should get you to a proper garage in the city." "Really?" Hope lit up her face. "I can pay you, of course." Ray waved off the offer. "Let's fix it first, then talk." He jogged back, to his trailer and rummaged through his collection of spare parts. 5 minutes later, he returned with a length of hose that wasn't exactly right but would do the job. Working methodically, Ray drained what little fluid remained, cut away the damaged section of hose, and fitted his replacement using hose clamps from his toolbox. The woman watched curiously. "You've done this before," she observed. Ray smiled slightly. Hundreds of times, cars always break down in the worst places. As he worked, they exchanged names. She was Nicole, on her way to present at some big business conference. Ray didn't ask for details, and she didn't offer many. "So you live nearby?" she asked, glancing down the road. "That blue trailer down yonder," Ray said, tightening a clamp. "Been there most of my life." Nicole nodded, looking around at the vast emptiness surrounding them. "It's very peaceful out here." Ray could hear what she wasn't saying. Remote, isolated, poor. He'd heard it all before. "It's home," he said simply. With the new hose in place, Ray refilled the radiator with water from his own supply and a little coolant he kept on hand. "This'll get you to the city," he explained. "But first stop should be a garage. Tell them you need a proper replacement for this upper radiator hose. Don't let them sell you more than that. Engine looks fine otherwise." Nicole watched as he closed the hood. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "Somebody would have passed by eventually," Ray said, though they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. "This back road didn't see much traffic. How much do I owe you?" Nicole reached for her purse. Ray hesitated. Money was tight, had been for months. The electric bill was due next week, and his job prospects were slim. But looking at Nicole, he thought again of his grandpa. "Nothing," he said finally. "Just helping out." "I can't accept that," Nicole insisted. "You saved me hours of waiting, possibly hundreds in towing fees." Ray shook his head. "We all need help sometimes." After some back and forth, Ray accepted enough to cover the parts he'd used, nothing more. Nicole seemed both puzzled and touched by his insistence. As she prepared to leave, she handed Ray her business card. "If you're ever in the city and need anything, a job reference, whatever, call me. I mean it." Ray took the card to be polite, though they both knew people like him didn't move in the circles of people like her. Still, her eyes held genuine gratitude. "Safe travels," he said, stepping back as she started the engine. It purred to life, no more steam rising from under the hood. Nicole smiled, waved once, and drove away, leaving Ray standing in a cloud of dust on the empty road, business card in hand. He tucked it into his pocket without looking at it and picked up his toolbox. Just another day, he thought, heading back to his trailer as the setting sun painted the sky orange. Just another car fixed, another person helped on their way. He had no way of knowing that the business card in his pocket would change everything, or that in less than 72 hours, the sound of helicopter blades would be cutting through the quiet afternoon air above his humble home. 3 days passed since Ray helped the woman with her car. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm. Wake up, search for job listings, fix what he could around the trailer, and try not to worry about the bills piling up on his small kitchen table. That morning, he'd walked to the corner store for the newspaper, circling 2 mechanic positions in the classifieds with his pencil stub. One was clear across town, the other paid barely above minimum wage. Neither seemed promising. The afternoon sun hung high when Ray stepped outside to check on the tomato plants he was growing in buckets. Their leaves had started to yellow. Too much water or not enough, he wasn't sure. Gardening had been his mama's talent, not his. Still, he tried each year, hoping something of her gift had passed down to him. That's when he heard it. A distant, thumping sound cutting through the quiet. At first, Ray thought it might be thunder, though the sky was clear blue in every direction. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, mechanical. Helicopter blades. Ray shaded his eyes and looked up, spotting the aircraft circling overhead. Black and sleek, it looked like something from a movie. Definitely not the medical helicopters that occasionally passed by on their way to the hospital in the next county. What in the world? He muttered to himself, watching as the helicopter began a slow descent toward the empty field beside his property. Dust and loose papers swirled up from the ground as the helicopter touched down about 50 yards from his trailer. Ray stood frozen, one hand still holding the garden hose as the blades slowed their rotation and a door slid open on the side of the aircraft. Two people emerged. One was Nicole, the woman whose car he'd fixed, now in a different fancy outfit but still unmistakable. Beside her walked an older man, tall and distinguished-looking with silver hair and the confident stride of someone used to being listened to. Ray set down the hose and wiped his hands on his jeans, suddenly aware of his worn t-shirt and the dirt under his fingernails. Whatever was happening, it was definitely not an ordinary Tuesday. "Hello again," Nicole called out, waving as they approached. Her smile seemed genuine, though Ray noticed she kept glancing between him and the older man with a nervous energy. "Afternoon," Ray replied cautiously. "Quite an entrance you made." The older man stepped forward, extending his hand. "You must be Ray." "I'm Thomas Reynolds, Nicole's father." Ray shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the expensive watch that caught the sunlight. "Nice to meet you, sir. Though I'm guessing you didn't fly a helicopter out here just to say hello?" Thomas chuckled, the sound oddly familiar though. Ray was certain they'd never met. "No, we didn't. May we talk? It's important." Ray hesitated, then gestured toward his small porch with its mismatched chairs. "Not much, but you're welcome to have a seat." As they settled on the porch, Ray offered water, the only thing he had to serve guests. Nicole accepted graciously while Thomas looked around, taking in the humble surroundings with an expression Ray couldn't quite read. "My daughter told me how you helped her the other day," Thomas began. "Said you refused payment too. That kind of decency is rare these days." Ray shrugged. "Just did what anyone would do." "No," Thomas said firmly. "Not everyone would, especially not someone in your circumstances." He paused, studying Ray's face intently. You remind me of someone. That's partly why we're here." Ray waited, unsure where this was heading. Thomas pulled an old photograph from his jacket pocket and handed it to Ray. "Do you recognize either of these men?" The photograph was faded, its colors washed to sepia tones by time. It showed two young men in mechanics' uniforms standing beside an old model car, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning widely. The sign behind them read, "Reynolds Automotive." Ray's breath caught. One of the men was unmistakably his father, younger than Ray had ever known him, but with the same eyes, the same proud stance. "That's my daddy," Ray said quietly, pointing. "But he never mentioned working at any place called Reynolds. He was always at Jim's garage across town, far as I knew." Thomas nodded slowly. "The other man is me about 40 years ago. Your father and I weren't just co-workers, we were best friends." Ray looked up sharply. "That doesn't make sense. My daddy never mentioned you." "There's a reason for that," Thomas said, his voice heavy with what sounded like regret. "A reason I've spent decades trying to make right." Nicole watched quietly as her father leaned forward in his chair. "Your father was the best mechanic I ever knew," Thomas continued. "My family owned Reynolds Automotive back then. Small shop, big dreams. Your daddy and I were going to be partners, expand the business together." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But then he met your mother, and my father. He didn't approve." Ray's hands tightened around the photograph. He'd heard whispers about his parents' relationship facing disapproval, but details had always been scarce. His mother died when he was young, and his father never liked talking about the past. "My father was old-fashioned in the worst ways," Thomas said, his voice low. "When he found out your parents were serious about each other, he forced me to choose the family business or my friendship with your father." "And you chose the business," Ray said, no question in his voice. Thomas nodded, shame evident in his expression. "I was young, afraid of being cut off. By the time I found my courage to stand up to him, your parents had left town. My father had used his connections to blacklist your daddy at every garage in the state." Ray remembered the way they'd moved from town to town during his childhood, how his father had taken whatever jobs he could find, often hiding his mechanical skills for reasons Ray never understood. That's why he never talked about his past, Ray murmured. Why we never stayed anywhere too long. Your father was proud, Thomas said. Too proud to come back and ask for help, even after my father passed away. I searched for him for years, but the trail always went cold. Nicole spoke up for the first time. When I told Dad about the kind man who fixed my car, who lived on this land and had a way with engines like he'd never seen before, he knew it couldn't be coincidence. Thomas reached into his pocket again and pulled out another photograph, this one showing Ray's grandparents standing in front of the very trailer they sat beside now. Your grandfather bought this land from my father, Thomas explained. They had their own arrangement, one my father never told me about until he was on his deathbed. Your grandfather was smart, made sure this place would always belong to your family no matter what. Ray's mind was spinning, trying to connect these new pieces to the puzzle of his family history. Why are you telling me all this now? Thomas and Nicole exchanged glances. Because there's more to your inheritance than just this land, Thomas said. Your grandfather did something my father never expected. He invested in our company, secretly, through a trusted friend. Those investments were meant to go to your father and then to you. Nicole pulled out a folder from her bag and handed it to Ray. Inside were legal documents, stock certificates, and bank statements with numbers that made Ray's eyes widen. This belongs to you, Thomas said firmly. It's not charity, it's what should have been yours all along. What would have been yours if my father hadn't let his prejudice tear apart two families. Ray stared at the papers, then back at the photograph of his father. Young, hopeful, unaware of how his life was about to change. Outside, the helicopter waited, blades still, a surreal sight against the backdrop of his small trailer and the dusty field beyond. In that moment, Ray understood that his life would never be the same again, that the past his father had never spoken of had finally caught up with him, bringing with it not just answers, but possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. Morning sunlight streamed through the small window of Ray's trailer, casting long rectangles of light across his kitchen table. The same table where, just yesterday, Thomas and Nicole had spread out documents that changed everything Ray thought he knew about his family. He hadn't slept much. How could he? The folder they'd left behind sat untouched where they'd placed it, like something from another world that didn't belong among his chipped mugs and second-hand furniture. Ray made coffee in his old percolator, one of the few items he'd inherited from his grandmother, and sat down, finally ready to look through the papers properly. Yesterday had felt like a dream, the kind you wake from still feeling its effects but unable to hold on to the details. The helicopter had left before sunset. Thomas and Nicole promised to return this morning to answer any questions once Ray had time to process everything. They'd offered to put him up in a hotel in the city, but Ray had refused. He needed to be here, in the home that connected him to his past, to make sense of what was happening. With careful hands, he opened the folder and began to read. The legal language was dense, but the meaning clear enough. Stock certificates worth over $2 million. Land deeds for 40 acres surrounding his small plot. Bank accounts in his grandfather's name that had been growing interest for decades. This can't be real, Ray muttered to himself, though the official seals and signatures told him it was. Among the legal papers were more photographs, his father as a young man working on cars, standing proudly in front of what must have been Reynolds Automotive in its early days. His mother, beautiful in a summer dress, smiling at the camera with shy eyes. His grandparents at community gatherings, church events, moments of ordinary life now frozen in time. Ray's throat tightened. He had so few pictures of his family. After his mother passed, his father hadn't been one for keeping photographs around. Too painful, Ray always assumed. Now he wondered if there had been other reasons, memories his father couldn't bear to face. A knock at the door pulled Ray from his thoughts. Thomas and Nicole stood on his porch, dressed more casually than yesterday, but still looking out of place against the backdrop of his humble home. "May we come in?" Thomas asked, the formality in his voice softened by genuine respect. Ray nodded, suddenly aware of his small space, the worn furniture, the patches in the linoleum floor. Things he'd never given much thought to before yesterday. Coffee's fresh, he offered, pulling out the mismatched chairs around his table. It's not fancy, but it's hot. They settled around the table, the folder open between them. Outside, Ray could see the helicopter parked in the same spot as yesterday, its presence still surreal against the familiar landscape. Did you have a chance to look through everything? Nicole asked gently. Most of it, Ray replied, still trying to wrap my head around it all. Thomas nodded. I understand. It's a lot to take in. Why didn't my father ever claim any of this? Ray asked, the question that had kept him awake most of the night. Even after your dad passed away, even when times were hard for us. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. Pride, mostly, I think, and hurt. What my father did, the way he drove your parents away, blacklisted your father, that kind of wound doesn't heal easily. Plus, Nicole added, your grandfather arranged everything through a trust that wasn't set to reveal itself until 30 years had passed. He was protecting your family in the only way he could. Ray picked up a photo of his grandfather, a man he remembered only as strong hands and a deep laugh, standing beside a much younger Thomas. Were they friends? Ray asked. My grandfather and your father? Thomas shook his head. Not exactly. Your grandfather worked as the groundskeeper for my family's estate. He saw everything. How your father and I built that business together. How my father tore it all apart when your parents fell in love. He tapped the photograph gently. Your grandfather was smarter than anyone gave him credit for. He saved every penny, invested wisely. When Reynolds Automotive was just starting to grow, he bought shares through a friend who worked at the bank, someone my father would never suspect. He was playing the long game, Nicole said with obvious admiration, making sure there would be justice eventually, even if he didn't live to see it. Ray sat back in his chair, taking it all in. So what happens now? Thomas leaned forward. That's entirely up to you. Legally, everything in that folder belongs to you. The money, the stocks, the land, it's all yours with no strings attached. But, Nicole added, we do have a proposal if you're willing to hear it. Ray nodded and Nicole continued. Reynolds Automotive has grown into a national chain. We have shops in 38 states, but lately, she glanced at her father. Lately, we've lost our way, Thomas finished for her. Become too corporate, too focused on profits over people. The very thing your father and I promised we'd never do when we started. He pulled out another folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table to Ray. We want to create a new division within the company, Thomas explained as Ray opened the folder. Focused on training mechanics from underprivileged backgrounds, offering affordable repairs in communities that need it most, and developing more sustainable practices. Ray looked at the business plan outlined in the new documents. And you want me involved because you're the rightful co-owner, Thomas said simply. Because your father helped build the foundation this company stands on. And because when my daughter's car broke down on a dusty road, you showed her the same kind of integrity and skill your father was known for. Nicole nodded. We don't just want your name or your money, Ray. We want your expertise, your perspective. This company should have been partly yours from the beginning. Ray stood up and walked to the small window, looking out at the land that had been in his family for generations. Land that, he now knew, extended far beyond the boundaries he'd always assumed. Outside, the morning sun illuminated possibilities he'd never imagined for himself. A chance not just for wealth but for purpose. A way to honor his father's legacy while building something new. I need some time, he said finally, turning back to face them. This isn't just about money for me. It's about family, history, things I never knew and need to understand before I make any decisions. Thomas nodded, respect evident in his eyes. Take all the time you need. We've waited decades to right this wrong. A few more days or weeks won't matter. As they prepared to leave, Ray picked up the photograph of his father and Thomas as young men, full of dreams and unaware of the challenges ahead. My daddy always said a man's true character shows in how he fixes what's broken, Ray said quietly. Not just engines, but mistakes. Relationships. Thomas stopped at the door, his eyes misting slightly, Your father was a wise man. Wiser than I was back then. I just hope it's not too late to fix what my family broke. Ray looked from the photograph to the helicopter waiting in the field, symbols of a past and future now colliding in ways he never could have predicted. Maybe it's not about fixing the past, Ray said. Maybe it's about building something new from the pieces. 2 weeks passed since the helicopter first landed by Ray's trailer. 2 weeks of phone calls with lawyers, meetings with financial advisors, and long walks around land that he now knew belonged entirely to him. Land that stretched far beyond the small plot his trailer sat on, encompassing rolling hills and a creek that cut through ancient oak trees. Ray sat on his porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. He'd spent the day in the city with Thomas and Nicole, touring the main headquarters of Reynolds Automotive. The gleaming building with its glass doors and modern offices couldn't have been more different from the small garage where his father and Thomas had once worked side by side. A lot to take in, he murmured to himself, thinking about how life could change so suddenly. 2 weeks ago, he'd been counting pennies to keep the lights on. Now, he had more money in the bank than he'd ever imagined possible. Yet he still lived in his trailer, still wore the same worn jeans and work boots. Some changes took time to feel real, to feel earned. The sound of tires on gravel caught his attention. A car was coming up the long driveway, Nicole's sleek sedan, now familiar after several visits. She'd been the one to guide Ray through the maze of paperwork, explaining legal terms and business concepts with patience and respect. As the car parked beside his old pickup truck, Ray stood to greet her. Nicole stepped out, more casually dressed than usual in jeans and a simple blouse, carrying a folder under her arm. "Evening," Ray called. "Didn't expect to see you again today." Nicole smiled, climbing the porch steps. "I had some new drafts of the proposal I wanted to drop off. Thought you might want to look them over before tomorrow's meeting." Ray nodded, gesturing to the second chair on the porch. It was new. He'd bought a matching set last week. Small changes he could make without, feeling like he was leaving his old life behind too quickly. "Coffee?" he offered. "Or I've got sweet tea in the fridge." "Sweet tea would be perfect," Nicole said, setting the folder down. "It's been a long day." When Ray returned with 2 glasses of tea, Nicole was looking out at the land, eyes tracing the path of the creek visible from the porch. "It's beautiful out here," she said, accepting the glass. "Peaceful. Been thinking about building a proper house," Ray admitted, sitting down beside her. "Nothing fancy, but something with a bit more room. Maybe closer to the creek." Nicole smiled. "That sounds nice. But you're keeping the trailer too?" Ray nodded firmly. "This was my grandparents' home, then my parents'. It stays right where it is." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. Over the past 2 weeks, they'd developed an easy friendship built on shared purpose and mutual respect. "How'd it go with the team today?" Nicole asked finally, referring to the group of engineers and designers Ray had met that afternoon. "Dad said they were excited to get your input on the new training program." Ray sipped his tea thoughtfully. "Good folks, smart. But they've got some misunderstandings about what it's really like to learn mechanics without fancy tools and computers." He'd spent hours explaining to the team how he'd learned his trade, not just from manuals and classes, but from necessity. How to fix an engine with limited parts, how to diagnose problems using all your senses when you couldn't afford diagnostic. "Machines. That's exactly why we need you," Nicole said. "Those perspectives are what's been missing." She opened the folder between them, revealing blueprints for a building, larger than Ray had expected. "What's this?" he asked, leaning closer to see the plans in the fading light. "Our proposal for the first training center," Nicole explained. "We were thinking Atlanta for the headquarters, but then I remembered something you said about small towns needing opportunities the most." The blueprints showed a modern facility with classrooms, garage bays, and what looked like community spaces. The proposed location was just 10 miles from Ray's property, in the small town where he'd been unsuccessfully job hunting for months. "You want to build it here?" Ray asked, surprised. "Not in some big city?" Nicole nodded. "If you think it makes sense, the idea is to create something that can be replicated in other rural areas. places where young people have talent but no opportunities, to develop it. Ray studied the plans, mind racing with possibilities. He thought about all the times he'd wished for a chance like this when he was younger. All the kids in town now who tinkered with cars but had no path forward, no way to turn natural talent into a stable future. This could work, he said slowly, ideas forming as he spoke. But we'd need to think about transportation. Lots of folks around here don't have reliable cars to get to and from training. Nicole pulled out a notebook and began writing. What else? For the next hour, they sat on the porch as darkness fell completely, refining plans based on Ray's intimate knowledge of the community and its needs. By the time they finished, the blueprint had evolved into something more practical, more rooted in the realities of rural life. You know, Nicole said as she gathered her notes, my father's been running this company for 30 years and he never thought of half these considerations. Ray shrugged. Different experiences lead to different insights. That's all. Nicole studied him for a moment. You're going to accept the partnership, aren't you? The question hung in the air. Ray had been considering the offer for 2 weeks now, to become an equal partner in the new division of Reynolds Automotive, using his inheritance shares, plus his expertise to shape the company's future. I'm thinking yes, Ray said finally, but with conditions. Name them. First, we call it Johnson Reynolds Technical Academy, Ray said, honoring his family name alongside Thomas's. Second, we make sure at least half the instructors come from backgrounds like mine, folks who learned through necessity, not just formal education. Nicole nodded, making notes. And third, Ray continued, his voice growing more confident, we set aside 20% of the profits to provide startup funds for graduates who want to open their own shops in underserved communities. Nicole looked up from her notes, a slow smile spreading across her face. Dad's going to love this. It's exactly the kind of vision we've been missing. Later, after Nicole had left with promises to update the proposal for tomorrow's meeting, Ray walked out, onto his land still a strange thought, and looked up at the stars. The same stars his father had looked at and his grandfather before him. Hope I'm doing right by you, he whispered to the night sky. The changes coming felt both terrifying and right, not just the money, which still seemed unreal, but the purpose that had come with it. A chance to create opportunities his father never had, to build something that mattered. As he walked back toward the trailer that held all his memories, Ray felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, but certainty. The certainty that came from knowing exactly who you are and what you're meant to do. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and contracts, handshakes and signatures. The official beginning of a new chapter. But tonight, under the vast canopy of stars, Ray simply allowed himself to feel grateful for the strange twist of fate that had brought him here. A broken-down car, an act of kindness, and the long-delayed justice his grandfather had set in motion decades ago. 1 year later, Ray stood on the freshly paved parking lot, watching as workers mounted the large sign above the entrance. Johnson Reynolds Technical Academy. The modern building gleamed in the morning sunlight, all glass and steel, yet somehow fitting perfectly against the backdrop of rolling hills and open sky. His old blue trailer still sat on its original spot, just visible in the distance. Beside it now stood Ray's new home, modest by the standards of what he could afford but spacious and solid, with a wide porch that wrapped around the entire structure. He'd designed it himself, insisting on materials that would last generations. Ready for the big day? Thomas asked, joining Ray as they both looked up at the sign. The past year had aged the older man in good ways. His face more relaxed, eyes clearer, as if unburdened by the secret he'd carried for so long. As ready as I'll ever be, Ray replied, straightening the collar of his new button-up shirt. After a lifetime of worn t-shirts and jeans, dressing more formally still felt strange, though he'd compromised by keeping his trusty work boots. Some things a man doesn't give up, no matter how much money comes his way. Inside the building, dozens of people bustled about, preparing for the grand opening ceremony. The main entrance led to a spacious lobby where photographs lined the walls, pictures of Ray's father and Thomas as young men, of the original auto shop where they'd once worked together, of Ray's grandfather and the land that had stayed in the family through decades of hardship, a visual testament to the journey that had led to this day. Beyond the lobby stretched 10 fully equipped training bays, each named after a different person who'd influenced Ray's life. The Big Joe Bay honored his father. The Miss Ella classroom celebrated his mother's love of learning. Even Mr. Wilson, whose closed shop had left Ray unemployed a year ago, had a small office named in his honor. "There you are," Nicole called, clipboard in hand as she approached. "The press is starting to arrive and the first class of students is assembled in the main hall." Ray nodded, taking a deep breath. 50 young people from the surrounding counties had been selected for the Academy's first cohort, all from backgrounds similar to Ray's own, all with natural talent but limited opportunities. For the next 2 years, they would receive not just technical training but business education, mentorship, and guaranteed job placement. "Any sign of the helicopter?" Ray asked, checking his watch. Nicole smiled. "Just landed. He'll be here any minute." The he they referred to was the governor, who had taken personal interest in the project after learning its unusual origin story. What had begun as a private venture had evolved into a public-private partnership, with state funding allocated to replicate the model across 5 more counties by the end of next year. As they walked toward the main hall, people stopped to greet Ray, contractors who'd worked on the building, local officials who'd helped navigate permits and zoning, mechanics Ray had personally selected to serve as instructors. No longer the invisible man walking home from a bus stop, he now moved through the world as someone whose presence mattered, whose ideas were valued. Yet despite the external changes, Ray remained fundamentally himself, direct in speech, thoughtful in manner, careful with promises, and generous with knowledge. The wealth had changed his circumstances, but not his character. The main hall buzzed with conversation as Ray entered. The 50 students, ranging in age from 18 to 42, sat in new coveralls bearing the Academy's logo. Among them were 16 women, a point of particular pride for Ray, who'd insisted on active recruitment of female mechanics despite skepticism from some of the old-timers he'd hired. Near the back of the room sat an elderly couple Ray had specifically invited. The Wilsons, former owners of the garage where he'd worked before it closed. They'd been struggling in retirement until Ray offered Mr. Wilson a position as a special advisor to the Academy, bringing decades of practical experience to the curriculum development. Ray made his way to the small stage at the front of the room, nodding to familiar faces as he passed. On a table beside the podium sat something that had traveled with him from his trailer to this new building. His old red toolbox, dented and scratched from years of use. A reminder of where he'd started. The room quieted as Ray reached the microphone. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, but today's words came from his heart. "Welcome," he began simply. "1 year ago, I was a broke man fixing a stranger's car on the side of the road. Today, we're opening doors that will never close again. Doors to opportunity, to learning, to futures that might otherwise never happen." He gestured to the students. "Every one of you has something that can't be taught. Natural talent, intuition about engines, hands that know how to make broken things work again. What we're offering here isn't just education. It's a chance to turn what you already have into something that can support you and your families for life." Ray pointed to his old toolbox. That right there held everything I owned related to my trade, tools I'd collected over decades, some handed down from my father. They were enough to keep me working, but not enough to change my situation. He paused, looking out at the young faces watching him intently. What changes situations isn't just tools or money. It's opportunity. Connection. Someone believing in you when you're still figuring out how to believe in yourself. From the corner of his eye, Ray could see the governor entering quietly through a side door, flanked by aides. Thomas gave him a subtle nod. Time to wrap up the personal remarks before the official ceremony began. "So here's my promise to you," Ray continued, his voice stronger now. "What happened to me, the helicopter, the inheritance, all of it, that was luck. Luck my grandfather planned for, but still luck. What happens to you here won't be about luck. It'll be about work, about skill, about building something together that matters. He gestured around the room, to the instructors, the administrators, the community members who had gathered to support the academy's first day. Everyone in this building believes in second chances, in delayed justice, in the power of knowing how to fix what's broken, whether it's an engine or a community or a family legacy. Ray stepped away from the podium, picking up his old red toolbox. He opened it to reveal a set of brand new tools, 50 identical sets, one for each student. These are yours to keep, no matter what happens next. Your first professional tools. Use them well. As the students came forward one by one to receive their toolboxes, Ray caught Thomas and Nicole watching from the side of the room, pride evident in their expressions. The circle that had begun with an act of kindness on a dusty road was complete, not ending with Ray's good fortune, but expanding to include others who needed only a chance to prove their worth. Outside, the sign caught the midday sun, casting a shadow that stretched toward Ray's old trailer in the distance, connecting past and present, hardship and opportunity, broken things and the hands skilled enough to fix them.